I'm very proud to be here. I am a native Georgian, don't hold that against me, and we'll just call it the last battle. That's all right. I had no intention of talking about the Navy today or the museum, really, unless you all have questions as we wrap it up. My talk today is about loss. And Shay May looked at me funny when I said that a minute ago, because she's used to me laughing and giggling through a talk. But I will attempt to be a little more retrospective and serious today, although I can't promise that I won't throw in a laughter, because as we all know, you have to laugh your way through life whether you like it or not, as I'm sure they did then and we do now. But I guess I'll start. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 million Americans who fought in the Civil War. Those numbers vary, of course, but that was, I think that's a good number. There were 1.5 to 2.5 million Union soldiers, 750 to 1 million Confederate soldiers. And when you add all that up, that comes to almost 3.5. We'll never know how many men and women died during the Civil War. We'll never know how many Confederate or Union, black and white, men or women, soldiers and civilians died for whatever the cause was that they believed in. And they went out to fight for that cause, and that was the choice they made. The number that we've used forever for the dead is about 620,000. That number was actually developed through a great deal of research done by 2 Union veterans right about the turn of the century. So it was a legitimate number for many, many years. But during the past, I don't know, I heard it some 8 to 10 years ago. In recent years, that number has increased. Increased considerably to somewhere between 720 to 750,000. Some would say even 800,000 men died during the Civil War. Now, using the 620 number, we did not reach the death toll in any of our other wars put together until we reached somewhere in the middle of Vietnam. But if you're looking at what I consider a more legitimate number of 720-ish, then we still have not reached that number. So we can honestly say that more men died, more Americans died during the Civil War than in any other war that America has fought total together to this day. That's a lot of people. That was 2.5% of the population of the United States as a whole at that time. Today, if you looked at 2.5% of our population, you would be hitting about 8 million people. And I'm not good at counting, because I'm a history major. I don't count. But I think we might miss 8 million people. I mean, I know there's a lot of folks in this country, but I feel like we'd miss 8 million people somewhere along the line. The country as a whole, North and South, and that's the way I'll refer to it, the country was not prepared for this type of death. I hadn't had a war on our ground since the Revolution. That's a lifetime before. There were so few people. I think perhaps I've heard of 1 or 2 that were still alive from the Revolution when the Civil War started, or at the end of the 50s during the massive disagreements. They were not prepared for the number of dead that those 4 years would bring, and the amount of carnage on the battlefields. Those of you who have served, perhaps in battle, understand that better than the rest of us. But at that time in the 1860s, technology had greatly outreached tactics. And while men will still marching across the field shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the guy in front of you to get shot down and then you're up next, technology had advanced tremendously. And we do talk a lot about technology at the museum, but it's on ships. You can just make that translation into ground troops, certainly. So there was a lot of carnage. There were a lot of blown up bodies and nasty gore and blood and lost limbs and everything else that you can imagine. And viewing the battlefields at the end of those experiences must have been a terribly traumatic experience. As you know, photography was still very new during the Civil War. Photographs were taken before battles or during down times, and then after battles when you're taking a picture of a battlefield. And the battlefield, of course, had what? Had dead men and dead mules and dead horses. And after a day or two, they had smelly dead horses. So it was a wonderful place to be. Photographers came and took those pictures and took them home with them, north and south, and put them in a form we might call an exhibit today, with hopefully with the names of the dead underneath, so that families, if they were lucky enough to see it, knew whether or not their husband or their son or their father or whoever made it through that battle or not. So it was the first time that Americans in general had seen that type of experience. It pitted not just neighbor against neighbor, countryman against countryman. It pitted family members against family members. And in many instances that was absolutely the truth. And it was a terrible experience. Now, I'm sure you all know that 2 of the 3 deaths during the Civil War were from disease, not battle. From disease, and we may say, oh, well, that was disease, that didn't count. Yes, it did. Yes, it did. It was a camp was an icky place to be. It was kind of like a college frat house, or maybe a middle school boys' gym locker times 100, to give you an idea. It was stinky. Contaminated water. You're going to go to the bathroom over here and you're going to drink the water over here. So, who knows? Terrible hygiene. Unhealthy diets. The amount of cornbread and hardtack and flour that those men ate for 4 years, I'm just going to say it. I don't know whether they had more diarrhea or constipation, but whichever it was, it came out pretty bad. And diarrhea was one of the terrible illnesses, infections, diseases that these men had, and certainly a lot of that came from their diet. There was also almost nothing known about germs. No one knew that you passed germs on through the air, or through the clothing that you shared with somebody, or through the bandages that you used over and over and over again. So men were getting epidemics of diarrhea, of malaria, smallpox, pneumonia, mumps. The mumps that we think are gone today were rampant, and measles. And we've all heard the recent stories about the measles and how terrible they are today with the amount of medical knowledge and the shots that we have available to us. Well, I read in one instance that measles hit the 15th Alabama, so I will come home a little bit. The 15th Alabama. Even the surgeons with group did not understand that disease was carried in the air, on droplets of air. So everybody standing close together like we are, we're passing the measles from one person to the next, to the next. And you've heard on the news now what happens when you get the measles. Fevers, rash, you get the runny nose and watery eyes of a cold, you get the coughing. Once everybody had that, few people survived. Those that lived a little while usually got pneumonia or encephalitis, which is a brain disease, and middle ear infections. They had convulsions. And when you've got a camp full of 19-year-olds, the average age of a soldier was 25. So a camp full of 25-year-olds, and they've all got a disease like that. It's a horrible thing to experience. The one Alabamian said, well, let me take it back. Step back a minute. When you get sick like that, where do you want to be? You want to be home. And you want your mama to take care of you. You just do. And it doesn't matter who you are, you still want your mama to take care of you. And every one of those men that was dying, in their minds, what they're thinking of as they're laying there, and it's a slow death. Well, I want to go home. I wish I was home. And one Alabamian stated here, the thought of home is ever uppermost in the mind, and a wish exists to be buried with their fathers and the companies of their youth. Okay, let's move back to the battlefield, or the aftermath of the battlefield. One report that I read said that there were 60,000 surgeries, and I'm sure these were major surgeries done during the war. I actually think there were many, many more than that. I can't imagine that it was just 60,000. But the record says that 75% of those were amputations. And again, that's something we all have heard a little bit about, and I want to mention it for two reasons. First, because when I used to do programs for middle school kids, they loved for me to tell them how to amputate an arm. You have never seen such excitement in your life as when I would bring a kid up to the front and explain in great detail how to amputate a body part. This is for you. You're welcome. The other reason that I talk about this is because it literally and figuratively changed the view and the look of this country for a generation after. For 50, 60, maybe 70 years afterwards, almost anywhere you go, you would see a Civil War veteran missing a leg, or missing an arm, or missing a hand. And all the old stories are true. I told my husband one last night that these two friends from childhood who had both lost opposite legs met up at the store every year and bought their pair of shoes and split them. That's the way to save money. There you go. The mini balls that were used during the war, again, technology had outstretched tactics, but they shattered bones. And if you're shot on the battlefield, most soldiers want to go ahead and get shot in the head or the neck or the stomach or the chest and go ahead and die, because you don't want to go to a battlefield hospital where the butchers were. So getting shot in an arm or leg and then having to lay on the battlefield, getting a little bit of gangrene, a little bit of dirt in your wounds, and the heat and the sweat and everything else, it was not a pleasant expectation to go and lay down on the bed in front of the door or the wooden table or whatever you've got in front of the surgeon to get worked on. Soldiers didn't try to save doctors didn't try to save those arms and legs, not because they were butchers, because doctors had never seen this kind of terror before themselves. They had never experienced this kind of battlefield gore. They took their arms and legs and whatever, because it was the quickest way to save this man's life, and the quickest way then to get to the other, whether it was 10 or 1,000 men laying outside in the heat or the cold, bleeding to death. So you have to make decisions and go with it. But as I said, doctors had never seen things like that. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know about bacteria. They used the same bandages over and over again without washing them. They had, blood on their aprons. They used the same tools and utensils and saws and everything else. And if the guy over there died, let's take the bandages off. We've got a guy over here that needs them. So you're sharing all of that infection and disease amongst what could end up being hundreds and hundreds of men. And in many cases, it's not the amputation that kills you, it's the infection and disease you get afterwards. Like my buddy Stonewall. You got it. When the soldiers died on the battlefield, they were most often buried there. Because who knew, or at the hospital where they were taken to be treated, who knew what to do with them? There were no graves registration officers. There were no dog tags. There was no system for writing a letter home to tell your family that your loved one had been killed. Your buddy next to you did that. And if you were lucky, your buddy next to you took your whatever there was left of your personal possessions and went home and took them home to your parents or your wife or your children. If you did know where your son's body was buried and you went to get it after the war or after the armies had left, you were lucky enough to have the money to get there, then you had to find the body. Well, if it was marked with a wooden tombstone 2 or 3 years later, that tombstone was likely gone. And many families spent a major amount of money in that time to go and find their loved one and then come back home unsuccessful. Or if they did, those bodies were placed on trains, and then suddenly the very delicate, sensitive Victorian standards of death, which involved the big, heavy black dresses and the mourning apparel and the jewelry with the hair in it and wearing the clothes for years and years, and it was such a private process. Suddenly all of that became very, very public. You had bodies on trains that stopped at every train station, and crowds of people came out to cheer them on, and that was nice in its own way, but that was very, very shocking to those people who had approached death and dying in a totally different manner until 1861. It was truly a turning point in American history as to how it transformed attitudes towards death and the practices surrounding the body itself. Victorian America had a real deep preoccupation with the reality of death through literature and material culture and diaries and letters, but it was all very personal. It was not that public thing, and that had profound consequences on their sensibilities and totally changed forever how we handle death. By the middle of the war, it seemed that every household had lost someone, especially in the South. Loss was commonplace, and death was no longer dealt with individually. It was dealt with on a mass scale. And that question remained, how do we mourn these men? And how do we remember them? And how do we understand the enormous loss that we've experienced? And as I mentioned a minute ago, the armies were not ready, and they never seemed to get ready. They did not have those policies and those procedures in place. So when the battle was over and you start to deal with the dead, you've got sometimes, as we all know from those large battles, thousands and thousands and thousands of dead men strewn across the that was good. The ground. You've got to bury them, and you got to bury them in a hurry. And sometimes they were buried in mass graves. Sometimes they were buried without being marked, with the idea that later you could go back and move those bodies, and that was a great idea. But sometimes later it didn't come, and sometimes, as mentioned, you couldn't find the body, and so many families were left without any knowledge of their loved one's fate. Did he die? Was he wounded? Did he die at a prisoner of war camp? Did he take off and head west? The number of possibilities are endless. What happened to my husband? Where did he go? They don't know the circumstances. They don't know where he was buried. The numbers that we have here say that at least half of the dead, at least half of that 720,000 are unknown soldiers. Just like this young man here. We do not know who they were and what their name was. That does not take away from their life, from their family, or from the depth of the gift that they gave through their death. As the war came to an end, commissions were created to sort out records and try to get those bodies home, but it was not as successful as one might have hoped. Bodies were moved to national cemeteries, to those national battlefields. The bodies were collected, just like here. We've moved this young man. You moved this young man 3 times to get him to his final resting place. And if you didn't have the records, would we even know that much today? I say all this because I'm one of those people who lost someone. Among those thousands of unknown soldiers that are out there, whether they are thoughtfully buried in a cemetery somewhere, in a mass grave or an individual grave. My great-great-grandfather, James Cody, from Warrenton, Georgia, went away to war in 1862. He had a young wife and a young daughter. He also had an infant son. And I believe, from what I've found, that he stayed home long enough to get that son born, who was born in early 62, first half of the year. And he named him Albert Sidney Cody, after Albert Sidney Johnson. So my mother's grandfather was always Albert Sidney Cody. He went to war in 1862, and he never came home. And we have no idea where his body was, or it lies today. And you have to come to peace with those things, and it's okay. You just have to work through those. There were, and one last statement here, after the war, the number I have here, between 65 and 68, there were 68,162 inquiries answered by the Missing Soldiers Office in Washington. Now, that may have been Union soldiers. I don't know if it was everyone or not. This is just a single line that I found somewhere. Or was it just that there were only answers to 68,000 questions? But obviously, mothers and wives and children and parents were trying to find their lost soldier and find them for a long time afterwards. Well, this young man's mother did not find her soldier, but I'm sure that she is at peace because someone else did and cared for him now for 155 years. And he's here today because of you all. So I want to thank you for letting me come and run on, and for this opportunity, and for Shay driving all the way over here from Biloxi. And now I'll shut up. Thank you.